Yeah, as you all are filtering into the event today, it would be great if you could rename yourselves in the participant list with your class year, so we have an idea of who's here today, and you might actually see a fellow classmate since we can't all go to reunion brick and mortar style this year. That would be great. I think based on the guest list, we have alums from the 60s all the way to 2025 today, if everyone comes. So that's great. Thank you. We'll just wait about a moment before we get started formally, but if anyone would like to share in chat what they've been doing for Earth Day today, if you did anything special for Earth Day, please share it on chat. Or if you have a favorite trail perhaps in the Bay Area that you'd like to share with the rest of us, so that as we get ready on our summer trail expeditions, that would be a great suggestion too. I know that here for me, there's a guy who's involved with the Friends of the Urban Forest, and he is at SF Tree Guy, and he has neighborhood tree walks where he identifies about 20 different trees in each neighborhood. And you can just go to your own neighborhood and click on the link, and he has a nice little tight 2-hour walk you can do in your own neighborhood or another neighborhood in San Francisco. And I know that I did one today over in Dogpatch, and it's been a really great thing to do during the pandemic. So that's my recommendation. All right, we got some good, we have some, we got some chats going. All right, well, I think we'll go ahead and just get started and let people in at our leisure. My name is Lisa Ryers. I'm one of the co-presidents of the Brown Club of Greater San Francisco. I'm class of 1990, and I think everyone knows that we are taping this for posterity so that it can be uploaded to our YouTube channel probably sometime this weekend. So if you have an issue with that, just feel free to just get rid of your video portion of Zoom. So today we're really excited to have some guests, not just from San Francisco, but Russell is coming to us from the state of Maine tonight. And we also have Lauren coming from Montana. So that's one of the saving graces of, this whole past year, is being able to expand some of our programming to the greater United States, not just greater San Francisco. So today we are heading north to Alaska with Authors Russell Heath, class of 78, who is the former director of the Southeast Alaska Conservation Council. And we also welcome conservation scientist Lauren Oakes, class of 04. And they're going to be discussing their books, Rinn's Crossing and In Search of the Canary Tree. So in a little bit of snowball sampling, Russell reached out to me about his book, and that led us to Lauren, so we could have a really unique discussion, especially when there is no formal Brown Club alumni club in Alaska just yet. So unless anyone wants to move up to Alaska and start one. So today we have with us Russell Heath, class of 78, who is the author of Rinn's Crossing. In his teens, Russell hitchhiked to Alaska and lived in a cabin on the banks of the Tanana River. In his 20s, he lived in Italy and then traveled overland across the Sahara through the jungles and over the savannas of Africa and into southern Asia. In his 30s, he sailed alone around the world in a 25-foot wooden boat. In his 40s, he wrote novels, and in his 50s, he bicycled the spine of the Rockies from Alaska to Mexico. He's worked on the Alaska Pipeline as an environmental lobbyist in the Alaska legislature and run a storied environmental organization fighting to protect Alaska's coastal rainforests. Several years ago, he moved to New York City to dig deep into leadership development and coaching. He now coaches business and nonprofit leaders intent on making big things happen in the world. We also welcome with us Lauren Oakes, class of 04. Lauren E. Oakes is a conservation scientist with the Wildlife Conservation Society, as well as an adjunct professor in the Department of Earth System Science at Stanford University, and a freelance writer. She wrote much of her book, In Search of the Canary Tree while teaching in the program in writing and rhetoric. It was selected as one of Science Friday's best science books of 2018, as well as the second place winner of the 2019 Rachel Carson Environmental Book Award, and a 2019 finalist for the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine Communication Award. In addition to publishing her climate and forest-related research in peer-reviewed journals, Lauren has contributed to National Geographic, the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, Scientific American, and LitHub, among other media and literary outlets. So welcome, Russell and Lauren. We're going to talk a little bit about your books. You're going to have a little presentation for us, a little visual presentation perhaps about Alaska, as well as read a little bit from your books. And you all who are attending today, feel free to drop your questions into chat as we're discussing, and we'll circle back and answer some of your questions. So the first question we have is obviously, how did you both end up in Alaska?
Lauren, why don't you go first?
Well, we're missing one piece of information, which was that I was an intern after graduating from Brown for SEAC when Russell Heath was the executive director. So we go back a long ways. I kind of always knew I wanted to study environmental issues and write, or at that time I was doing a lot of photography. I was really interested in environmental communications. And after I finished Brown, I was actually waiting for an assignment for the Peace Corps. And in the midst of that, I thought, okay, what are some interesting places to go to? And I really wanted to be doing some applied work and helping communities deal with environmental issues. I've been studying a lot of forest issues at that time still. So yeah, I was looking for internships. I ended up with an internship in Southeast Alaska. It was supposed to be 3 months. I ended up staying, 5 years? Almost just about 5 years, working for SEAC, working in fighting against the Pebble Mine, and which was a big development proposal that's still really persistent now. Anyhow, and when I left to go back to graduate school, I got my PhD at Stanford in an interdisciplinary environmental science program. And at that time, I really wasn't expecting to be drawn back to Alaska, but a year into graduate school, there was really only one place I wanted to be doing my research, and I returned. So it's been a long relationship now, many years of coming and going.
So I grew up in the suburbs of Philadelphia, and from the time I was weaned, I just couldn't stand them. I just really just like the suburbs of Philadelphia. And so I dropped out of school in high school. I left after 11th grade, and I did 1 year of college and quit there and just hitchhiked up to Alaska. And that was 1974, and moved into a cabin outside of Fairbanks and lived there. And, it was curious because I got radicalized in my probably the 18th year. So just the year before, 17th year, and went to Alaska as an ideologically driven or hijacked person as you can be in terms of the environment. And I loathe the pipeline. I would have done anything to stop it. I had all these fantasies of blowing it up. Well, of course, ultimately I ended on it. And it was a really good year for me. That year when I was living in this little cabin, and I ended up, started out as an ideological environmentalist, ended up working on the pipeline. It was a really good lesson for me of how difficult it is to remain pure in essence, and how easy it is to sell out. So I sold out and worked on the pipeline, and I had a great time. It was really an extraordinary experience for me. I worked on almost all the camps north of the Yukon River, all the way up to the Arctic Ocean and Prudhoe Bay. So that's what took me to Alaska. It was a great love of Alaska. It was a total. I was a total misanthrope. I couldn't stand being around people, and there's a real classic type of Alaskan who goes as far as the pavement. It's called the end of the road syndrome. You go to the end of the road and then you step off and move into the bush, and that was me. And I applied to Brown from Alaska, and here's a secret: I wouldn't have gotten into Brown except that I was applying from a log cabin in the middle of nowhere in Alaska. Because certainly my grades did not indicate Ivy League status. or Ivy League competence or whatever. And ironically, what I did is I went to Brown in the winter, and then I would come back and work on the pipeline during the summer. And you know, the pipeline, I could earn my entire tuition in 2 months. And then I would go back and I would go to the bursar's office and I would pay them in cash. I wasn't going to write them a check. I would put $100 bills on the table. And that's how I paid my tuition at Brown. And after Brown, you know, I spent a couple of years wandering around the world. And when I finally burned through all my pipeline money, I came back to Alaska, and I was there until 2010. So it was a good part of my life.
And you went to the other side. You went into conservation. So
I was always in conservation, but I just played both ends of the. Like any mercenary, I played at both ends of the spectrum there.
Well, I think your books are obviously a way to reconnect with the state that you no longer live in now. And Russell, you know, you're talking about working on the pipeline, but you also have characters in your book that, you know, the characters in your book are not all environmentalists, right? So that kind of creates that nice rounded out mechanism for all of the characters to interact in your book. Can you talk a little bit about Rinn's Crossing and how that got started and what that's about?
Yeah, certainly. So Rinn's Crossing is my second novel. My first one, Broken Angels, is entirely different. And what sparked Rinn's Crossing was, can I share my screen?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you should be able to.
Oh.
Here, I'll make you co-host. Try that.
Oh, I don't see the share the screen option here.
Okay. Well, you are a co-host, so maybe can you just talk about what we might be seeing?
Yeah, I'll just do that. So in the 1950s, the United States, in its eternal wisdom, thought that they would create economic development by building 5 large mills in Southeast Alaska, which is this tremendous rainforest. Even now, the Tongass National Forest is our largest national forest, and it's twice the size of the next largest national forest, which is also in Alaska. It's about the size of West Virginia. And the intent was to put 5 big pulp mills in Southeast Alaska and cut down the trees and essentially have a tree farm after that. They built 2 of the mills, and then people like SEAC or organizations like SEAC put those mills out of business. But in any case, in the 90s, while the mills were just about gone, I was just getting so furious at the destruction of the Southeast Alaska that I had this little fantasy in my head. And the fantasy was, well, why don't I just sneak into some of those logging camps and take out their machinery? I mean, it would take nothing because the camps are very remote and there's no security. No one would catch me. And then I got to thinking, well, what would happen if I did that and somebody else got charged with my crime? What would I do? And that was a spark in the novel, is what would you do if you did a little ecotage and you took out somebody else got charged with a crime? So the first chapter is Rinn taking out the machinery of this logging camp, and then ultimately his ex-lover gets charged with a crime and another murder that happened that night that he knew he didn't do, but she's charged with the murder. And then the second part is that I ran the Alaska Environmental Lobby for a while, also in the 90s, and I got to know the Alaska legislature and how things work really, really intimately. And I wanted to weave in a legislative plot or legislative thriller there. And so Rinn's lover or former lover, Kit, is the environmental lobbyist. And she is faced with having to kill 2 anti-environmental bills. And the only way she can do that is by stopping an amendment to the Constitution, state Constitution, that would give the Native Alaskans rights to subsistence resources that had been promised to them 2 generations before. So back in the 1970s. So those are the 2 intertwined plots. kid is charged with murder and sabotage, and she's got to stop two environmental bills. And the only way to do that is to stop the subsistence amendment, which of course she supports and the left supports. So it's a complicated story. And tell me, Lisa, did it keep you awake? Did it drive you through it? Did you get bored or lost?
No, I think I think you hit the nail on the head with that it does incorporate policy, but in a kind of packaged in a thriller. So it actually gave me some ideas about how I might approach some policy issues here in California, perhaps. But yeah, so similarly, Lauren, yeah, you kind of approach it from a scientist's point of view, and from just in a very minimalist way in terms of just directing all your attention to a single tree. So can you talk a little bit about the canary tree and why you had this this affinity towards this one particular tree, and
yeah,
the path
I was also just going to comment, I think it's unique to be in a discussion with a nonfiction and a fiction writer. And so experiencing, when I read Russell's book, there's so much, I mean, you see in both of them that there's a real sense of place and an understanding of the community that and the people there, the ecosystem that really informs the writing. So for me, that was a real, pleasure to see, and the depth that Russell goes to, and really to create a feeling of the landscape and value of this place, and also the diversity of people that are really confronting a lot of, have a different perspectives about how the land should be managed, whether you're talking about, fishermen coming in, loggers, native communities that have been there for centuries, thousands of years. So that was really just neat to see, given that I, from a scientist perspective, was doing both social and ecological research to understand how have the forests in Southeast Alaska been affected by climate change, and how are communities there starting to adapt to these changes. The story In Search of the Canary Tree is really much more of a personal story of someone who, through 6 years really embedded in this landscape and in the communities of my own journey of becoming someone highly educated about climate change and trying to reconcile how do I live with what I know moving forward. So I spent 6 years studying, going back and forth between Stanford and Southeast Alaska, studying how these yellow cedar trees are dying because of climate change, and how the forests are changing because of that. And then interviewing people in communities to understand, in light of these changes that are occurring, like very apparent on the landscape, how are they coping with them? And I basically felt like when I finished my PhD, I'll give a reading, I'll offer a couple of readings to start things off when we break out. But I basically felt like when I finished my PhD, I expected to feel this moment of completion, and I didn't. And it was, really that there were a couple things lingering, that I had spent so much time in these forests. They had affected me. I felt like I didn't do them justice in a scientific paper, my results. And I felt like the stories and the people who let me into their lives, was also like reduced to a table of results about climate adaptation. And they were certainly meaningful results, but there was so much more to the story, as well as my own struggle with, okay, what can I do moving forward to be contributing to the many different solutions that we need? So that's a little bit of a quick summary, and I'm happy to give a couple readings. But I'd also thought, just because it relates to both, I put together some slides. They're largely from my field work, but it'll give you a sense of the landscape and the forests.
Yeah, should we give that a shot? See if the screen
let me
share might work.
I was just trying on
end.
mine. It looks like it says it'll take mine. So
Okay.
let's try. Do you see?
Yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
All right, so here we are in Southeast Alaska, this little panhandle of the Alexander Archipelago. Like Russell said, largest national forest, but it's also one of the most intact remaining coastal temperate rainforests on the planet. So it is really of national and global value. It's an incredible place to be. Search of the Canary Tree. Moving along. Here are
Lauren,
some-
you're in the presenter mode. I think you might want to
Oh, okay.
swap to your,
Thank you. Okay.
yeah. I
Let
know
me
it's
just
always
do,
tricky on Zoom.
I don't need any notes, so let's just do
Yeah,
that.
there you go.
There you go. Okay, thank you. Thanks, Allison. So this is on the outer coast of Southeast Alaska. I worked, the places that I was working and doing my field research were accessible only by boat and kayak, which Russell was mentioning earlier before we got started. It's kind of like the end of the road. In Juneau, there's about 40 miles of road, and then anywhere else you're going to get to, you're going to get by boat or plane or foot. Here you can see these are the yellow cedar trees that are affected by climate change. I'll tell you a little bit more about that and how. But let's just take a minute to kind of soak in the landscape for a second. Some of these big trees. There's a sense of scale for you. Mighty spruce. Notice the rubber rain gear. This is one of the captains who would bring us out to our field sites. So we'd travel out and spend about 3 weeks at a time measuring trees and basically conducting an inventory of the health of the forest. This was my crew, a number of graduate students from different locations, Alaska, University of Washington, Berkeley, who at the time were I couldn't have done the research without them, but they obviously became characters in the book. This is the kind of bushwhacking we're talking about. So without trails, you're climbing up and over things all the time. Here we are standing or collecting data in a grove that's been affected by the dieback. So you can see those standing dead trees surrounding Odin. Very rainy that summer. We had about 3 summers of just intense rain. And I think the summer I finished collecting my data was quite sunny. So I don't know if I timed things quite well. Called those bathtub hands, basically all the time, living with just moist hands from being in the wet climate all the time. All our equipment to measure sites would fit in our kayaks. So we'd travel from site to site like that and set up a base camp where we were for 1 to 2 weeks at a time and then move it. So maybe I'll stop there and do you want to do a couple readings, Russell?
Lisa, what were your plans for next?
Yeah, I think if you have since you might be having a challenge with your visuals, if you just have a portion of your book that you would like to read from, and then we'll just ask Lauren to do the same and then open it up to questions.
Okay, well, I found my share screen button.
Yay.
So that's just to give an example of the clear cutting. Can you all see that?
Yeah.
of Southeast Alaska. And, you know, Lauren mentioned it's the largest unfragmented forest, but in some respects it's tremendously fragmented, particularly in the south and Prince of Wales Island. All right, so let me go back, stop share. And also just to emphasize something that Lauren said, you know, the landscape is truly exceptional. And you know, more than 1 million people come through Alaska every year on non-COVID years on cruise ships, just to look, just to kind of soak in the glory. But for those of us who lived there for many, many years, it's hard to get it out of your system. I mean, I left Alaska 10 years ago, and I still think of it every day. I kind of consider it like my PTSD. I just cannot stop thinking about Alaska. It's always kind of a presence. And part of it is, of course, is that the state really challenges you. It challenges you physically because of the cold, or Southeast Alaska, it's the wet. It challenges you also in terms of what you can do there, you know, kayaking or climbing mountains or crossing glaciers. And you have a shared adventure. So you always have a sense of camaraderie for the people, other people who have been there, who have lived there. And one of the things I wanted to do in Rinn's Crossing is really bring forth how much Alaska means to different people and different points of view. So there are 4 main characters in Alaska, and they all have a different vision of Alaska. And I tried to, and so, you know, one of the characters is a developer, another's an environmentalist, another's a native Alaskan. And I tried to portray Alaska through their points of view as non-ideologically as I could, but as personally as I could. And key to the story, it is a thriller after all, is that all 4 of those people are fighting for their vision of Alaska, and they all step over the line. You know, at some point, they think that what's important to them is important enough to make ethical or legal or moral compromises. And the paragraph that I'd like to read comes towards the end of the book, when Rinn realizes that his best friend, Dan Wakefield, who's an Alaska native, a Tlingit, has committed a murder. So let me just read that here. So Dan and Rinn had been friends. They had fought side by side for better things. And now both were running from crimes neither could have imagined of themselves just a few years ago. But the paths that brought them to where they each now stood were to Rinn as stark and clear as a razor's cut. Any path that you choose in life has obstacles in it. Obstacles which to overcome require that you nick some part of yourself. It might be your word, your ideals, your love for another. But to continue on your path, you have to compromise something. You hesitate, wondering if it would be wiser to turn back, but you've already gone this far. Your goals are so noble, and the compromise is so small. So you nick that part of yourself that the obstacle demands, and you move on. The next obstacle is a fraction larger, and again, you wonder whether your path is the right one. But nicking yourself is a second time is easier, even if the nick is deeper. And you nick yourself again and again and again, until at some point you've gone too far to turn back, even when the obstacle that blocks your path is a life.
Whew. Yeah. Yeah. And from what part of the book is that?
So it's about 2/3 of the way through.
Yeah. Wow.
And I haven't given anything away, by the way, so don't you worry.
I will have to just share with the audience. I did write this quote from your book that I enjoyed, where there's a character who's a senator from Alaska, and he says, "You people have turned this state into a no-touch fantasy land for overprivileged SpongeBobs from California. Why aren't they up here trying to make a living?" So I was thinking about that, having for the people living here for quite some time. So that's a nice counterplay from what you just read. And Lauren, you love it if you could read a bit from your book. one of the quotes I have from your book when you're just starting out going up to Alaska is, I came to Alaska looking for hope in a graveyard. And I was thinking about that just based on the year we've just spent on this earth. And that's one of the things that I really loved about reading your book was just, you know, your focus on this dying tree and your trajectory from that and what you learned. So please share with us what you have.
Yeah, thank you. So that's actually, I'm going to kick off with that, with reading from the beginning of the book. And then I thought I'd share a little bit about, yeah, just kind of how the journey unfolds and how it became more personal. So I'll read from two different sections, one right at the start, and then one actually that is a section I never anticipated being in the book. I'd say, I mean, everybody writes a plan when they put together well, most people, some writers maybe have different strategies, but I'd say mine is one of mapping out what the chapter is and what the narrative arc is going to be like. And the last third of the book entirely surprised me. I kind of cruised through writing the first 2/3, and I got to I basically made it through, you know, bringing you to the forests and bringing you out to the study the trees with me, bringing you into the homes of Native people to sit with me during interviews where I was really learning about how they're coping with these losses and what they're doing differently in their environment. I had written about all my research, and it was when I got to the third part, I realized, okay, there's something much more personal here that I haven't figured out. And I honestly think that was my hook for writing the book. Like, I needed to figure out, how do I have hope about the situation and what can I do moving forward? So the third section of the book, I kind of took off my hat as a scientist and, you know, became more of a reporter, to be honest, and went back to a lot of other scientists that I worked with over the years and started asking them, like, how has this research affected you? What do you do differently in your life? What is your outlook moving forward? And that's what really crafted the third section, and you know, what became a larger message of hope and action, and also one that I, you know, still follow today. So yeah, I'll just start by reading from the opening. I came to Alaska looking for hope in a graveyard. Ice melting, seas rising, longer droughts. In a world seemingly on fire, I chose to put myself in some of the worst of it. The Alexander Archipelago in Southeast Alaska is a collection of thousands of islands in one of the scarce pockets remaining on this planet, where thick moss blankets the forest floor and trees range from tiny seedlings to ancient giants. But I wasn't loading into a Cessna 4-seater to look for fairy tale forests of spruce, hemlock, and cedar. I was flying in search of the forest I'd study, the graveyards of standing dead trees and the plants I so wanted to believe could tell me, through science, that maybe the world is not coming to an end. Patches, I thought, were looking for the large patches of dead trees. I looked down at the sea of whitecaps and wondered what we'd face in the months ahead. I waited patiently and scanned the passing coastline for the cypress. Despite how much I had prepared, I really had no idea what I was getting myself into, scientifically, physically, or emotionally. To the left, the verdant coastline broke off into inlets and side channels. To my right, I could see the steep hillsides covered in white skeletons of dead trees, standing on end like telephone poles, leafless ghosts of the towering cypress. I had been so focused on building a sound scientific study that wouldn't get me or my crew killed that I hadn't given much thought to what I would feel when I first saw the standing dead. From the bird's eye view, the giant trunks looked like thousands of toothpicks stuck in the earth. If trees were people, anyone would have called it a tragedy, an epidemic running rampant through the community in the largest remaining coastal temperate rainforest on Earth. Deep inside my stomach, I felt a knot pulled tight around a sense of loss and fear. It was that kind of terrible feeling that surfaces when you drive past a wreck on the highway and the ambulances aren't racing anyone off to the hospital. You wonder who's gone forever, what lives are cracked, who's left behind to begin anew. It could happen to any one of us. And then you drive on because that's all you can do. Except for me, for this, there was no driving on from the standing dead, no going home, nor forgetting. I didn't know it then, but those trees would change my life. They made me feel vulnerable to our warming world in a way I had never before. There's a limit to change we can tolerate, I thought. There's a threshold and tipping point for every species, humans included. So, here we go. Ultimately, that's where the canary comes from. Those of you who may be familiar with the canary and coal mine, canaries were brought into mines in the early mining days because they're really sensitive to the air quality and toxins. So if a canary would die in its cage or start to show signs of illness, the miners would know they needed to get out of there before they became sick. So yeah, it really became an arc, and I'd say like a purpose of the book, in that I think that with climate change, it's hard to internalize what's coming or what's looming, what's happening until you've experienced something directly. And so I think that we're seeing more and more personal experiences with that then have the power to awaken you to action. Okay, so I'll just read from the, let's see, deciding as I go here. Okay. This is kind of the start of the third section when I realized there was something a lot more personal to figure out. On March 4th, 2015, I stood before an audience of over 100 colleagues, friends, and family members at Stanford University. It was my doctoral defense, the final hurdle. I thought if I passed, an enormous weight would lift. I'd feel a great sense of freedom to launch into my scientific career. That wasn't how it went. When the committee referred to me as Dr. Oakes for the first time, I felt relief, yes, but not the closure I'd expected. My research had been published in one scientific journal already. Others would soon follow, but something was missing. We measured 2,064 trees and 882 saplings. In just 5 words and 2 numbers that I wrote in that first paper, I removed months of my own experience, living and feeling, listening and breathing amidst those dead trees. In distilling 1,500 pages of interview transcripts into a single elegant table, I'd left out the way a logger runs his calloused hand over fine-grained wood in admiration, or the silence that fills the room before an Alaskan describes a yellow cedar. I'd cut the stories from the people I'd met who had found ways to benefit from the emerging environment while losing a species they used, valued, and loved. If writing is an act of discovery and subjectivity has no place in science, I imagined that only this book would bring me resolution. What hung over me was how to maintain a positive outlook amidst climatic chaos. I wanted the answer for myself, and I wanted it for us all. Why were some people I interviewed optimistic about the future, despite all they knew about climate change? I answered many questions at my public defense and in a 2-hour closed-door session with my committee afterwards. There were questions about plot design and metrics, about participant recruitment and limitations. It was not the science that still gnawed at me, but 2 questions I needed to resolve for myself. How do you live with what you know? And do you have hope about the future?
Yeah, I think the way that the word hope is echoed throughout the passage is really emblematic about just the tone of your book in general, which is really wonderful. But the way it also, you were doing hardcore scientific work of, measuring over 2,000 trees, over 800 saplings, and all the logistical work that needs to happen to make science palatable to everyone. I think one of the things you also mentioned in your book is that you didn't want to just study more, you want to do more. So maybe the 2 of you can talk a little bit about, here we are, trying to come out of transition, come out of this pandemic, getting vaccinated, being a little bit bolder about what we can do in real life, where we actually have the bandwidth perhaps to think more about these global issues. So maybe the 2 of you can speak to some of that just based on your experiences in Alaska and in policymaking and science, and then we can open it up to questions.
What are your thoughts, Lauren?
Yeah, Great question. Thank you for raising it. And I won't be a spoiler if I tell you where I landed, but I mean, honestly, I did try to figure out why were some people optimistic scientifically. Like I ran all kinds of like statistical tests with the data that I did to try and figure out like, are there driving things that make some people that are really knowledgeable about climate more optimistic than others? And I never really found any patterns. And as a scientist, I found that super frustrating. But as a, a citizen and a person, I just felt like, okay, well, the answer is actually, it's my choice. How do I frame this issue? And what do I think on a daily basis? And how do I live amidst this? That is my choice. And so, I often quote, like, I look at, David Wallace Wells' The Uninhabitable Planet as a contrast book, because, it's very much about the dark future we're facing. And I don't want to overlook the challenges, certainly in terms of climate change, now overlaid on top of that, many health issues that intersect and will continue to intersect. But I guess it left me feeling, or what I know is that we need all kinds of solutions. And so that there's no one silver bullet for climate change. There won't be for the pandemic either. And actually, we need people contributing in many different ways, in the ways that they can. So for me, I continue to do research. I would call it problem-solving research. So I work now all with communities that are facing climate impacts in their local communities, whether it's water issues or fire issues or coastal erosion. And they are people that are, wanting to do something differently on the ground to cope with those changes. So they're implementing new water management plans, or working with indigenous communities to innovate on fire management plans, all kinds of innovative ways to deal with the changes coming. And to me, that's my answer. And I have others, and I continue to write and try to bring both the issues and possible solutions to a greater population. But I mean, that's really what I hoped from this book, is that you would be left feeling what is within my power and what can I do. And I'd also say, coming out, I am kind of optimistic of, we have this great pause, right? It's like, what are you choosing to add back into your life? And I know I'm certainly going to be a lot more cognizant of the travel that I choose to do and why in the years ahead. I think that, communities and governments, particularly in the European Union, are putting a lot of great investments now into, building back better. Like, this is an opportunity of, we can create jobs that could also offer more, that could also offer mitigation, climate adaptation benefits moving forward. I usually show this figure that shows the pandemic. I can pull it up. It's kind of a little funny picture. The pandemic is this one blip on the problem, and there's this enormous one looming underneath it, which is climate change. Like, we're going to come up from air here, and I think we need to carry some knowledge forward of, we have a chance to do some things differently. And I want to be a part. Like, I'm only one person, but I want to be a part of doing that, helping that cause. I can show the slide if you want a little chuckle. It's a cartoon.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
We never turn down a chuckle.
Okay.
Oh, there's a chuckle.
There's not that one. Let me go. Oh, escape. Other slideshow. This one.
Yeah.
Here you go.
Otherwise, Russell, maybe you can speak to the same issue while Lauren's doing
Here it
her
is.
research.
I'll be happy when this is over. And here's the couple doctors looking at one problem. Okay.
You got it, Lauren? Did you find it?
Oh, I did. Yeah, I did.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, let's pop it.
Here, I'm having trouble. So you start it. You go ahead, Russell. Sorry.
Okay. Well, I have a great frustration with environmentalists, and I count myself one, of course. But, if you read an environmental book, and I'm not talking about Lauren's book, but a book that has 90% of it or 95% of it will be outlining this grievous, maybe even world-shaking problem. And the last paragraph, the last chapter will be how we can solve this problem. And the last chapter is almost always just politically naive. It's something along, well, if we all pull together and we do X, Y, and Z, then this problem will go away. And, you know, I've been involved with politics most of my life, and it's really, really difficult to make things happen. And you know, to say that I'm fundamentally pessimistic about us being able to solve many of the problems that face us is maybe an understatement. That said, and let me say, one of the problems that I see on the left, include environmentalists, is they have an idea of how they want the world to be, and they get really righteous about wanting the world that way, and they get really sanctimonious about wanting the world that way. But they don't have a good blueprint from how, a good political blueprint of how you're going to organize, how you're going to change people's minds, and how do you get them inspired towards a vision that moves a population, not just their own cultural or political bubble, but a population towards that end. And I think that's extraordinarily difficult to do. And, you know, there's some, you know, great leaders that have moved us in many extraordinary ways towards a better society. And this to me is the great irony of the modern day, and that in many, many respects, we live in a near Eden of a world, or near perfect world. If you know anything about the history and what it's like to have been a human being up until, you know, World War II, it is horrific. I mean, we would all be dead by now. There would be no Russell Heath, class of '78, still alive. And the fact that, say, in the last 10 years, you know, 750 million people were hauled out of abject poverty, and abject poverty defined by the UN as living on less than $2 a day, if you can imagine that. I mean, that's extraordinary. And we have fewer wars, fewer disease, more people are educated than any time in the past. Yet at the same time, we're eating away at, you know, at the fundamental environmental infrastructure that keeps us alive. So to me, that's kind of the great irony. But that said, I have a friend, his name is Steve Kallick, and he used to work for SEAC as well. And he's protected more land on this planet than any other single individual, and no one knows about him. I mean, over 100 million acres. And he says, you know, Russell, you're right, but I'm going to keep fighting this fight and hope that somebody smarter than me comes along to figure out how to solve it. And the other world, you know, the other issue for me is that almost every one of my projections about the future has been wrong. So I will grant that my projection, my pessimistic view of the world, is probably also wrong. And like Steve, still be in the battle, hoping that someone smarter than I comes along and solves the problems.
Okay. Well, I noticed you didn't share how Steve actually has saved all of this land, but maybe that's for another book.
Oh, I'd be glad to tell you. It's pretty amazing.
It's a character in a book. I did an event with Tony Hiss, who's another author. He used to be a New Yorker writer, and he has a book out called Rescuing the Planet, which is the first. I only know, Russell, I want to hear your story, but he's the first person that I feel like has written really extensively about Steve. Yeah. How did you?
Steve?
Yeah, he's a character in the book, because he goes back to look at, like, what are some models of people in Rescuing the Planet. He's looking at what are some models of people that have been the exception and how have they done it. And Steve is one of the people he found.
Yeah, if I could speak to SEAC, you know, SEAC did back long before I got to SEAC, back in the 80s, it ran an epic grassroots campaign that was nationwide that reformed the forest management on the Tongass National Forest. And it did it in the face of 2 Alaskan senators that were staunchly, adamantly, vehemently opposed to reforming timber management. And, you know, if you know politics, certainly federal politics, is that other senators don't screw in the backyards of their colleagues. And so the fact that SEAC, a tiny little organization, was successful in getting the Tongass Timber Reform Act, it was signed by George H.W. Bush, right, is one of the extraordinary grassroots campaigns in this country. And two people were involved in that campaign. One was Steve Kallick. And I say he's protected over 100 million acres, largely in northern Canada. So all that boreal forest. And Alaska and Canada is a rape and ruin state that puts that makes a United States look good. They live on their natural resources, and there are none of the citizen protections that we have in American law, in Canadian law. So he's managed to protect 100 million acres and more. But another person who also worked on that campaign was a man named Jay Nelson. And Jay Nelson has protected more of the Earth's surface than any other person on the planet. And he, working with Pew, they both work with Pew Foundation, started organizing and developing tremendous, what do they call them? It's the Ocean Legacy Project. Ocean reserves. We're not even fishing, sometimes not even tourism is allowed in the reserve. And the first one was the Northwest Hawaiian Reserve. So from the last populated island all the way to Midway, all those islands are now protected. There's 140,000 square miles of ocean surface protected. And he's gone on to do protect larger areas, also in the United States, in Guam, 2 off of Australia, 1 off of New Zealand, Chile, French, and Chagos Islands. So I can't remember how many millions of square miles, but so Jay Nelson and Steve Kallick both, cut their teeth on the Tongass Timber Reform Act at SEAC, and they've gone on to make tremendous contributions to the planet. Yay, SEAC.
Okay. Well, that does sound like a whole story in and of itself that we can probably follow up on. But in kind of our last couple minutes, I would like to, open it up. If some of you alums have some questions here for the Alaska Brain Trust here, please feel free to unmute yourselves. We can be pretty casual about this. Anyone? No potential trips to Alaska? No.
Lauren, I'm curious, when you were out in Alaska doing your surveying, how long would you stay out for a time? How many weeks out would you be before trips back to civilization?
It was about 2 to 3 weeks. We would pack for 3 weeks. We'd have extra food, and we'd have a certain number of sites that we were trying to get at like a first base camp. And then based on weather and when we finished, or in the first case, the first trip we took, we ran out of food. Then we'd figure out, call for help to get out. We had like a planned target date for the exit, but it was fairly flexible because I knew I basically would go up there for the full season, as much as I could get from early June to end of August, and know how many sites I'd need during that time. And it was kind of just, go try to get as many as you can. And we started with 1 a day. And then about halfway through the summer, we realized between the weather we were getting and our pace, like we needed to pick it up. So it got pretty busy towards the end. But 3 weeks was the longest. It was long enough that when you got off the plane, you'd come back into, we would get into Sitka or Gustavus. Sitka has more cement than Gustavus. So I remember always just feeling when I would get off the plane, like kind of weird walking on cement, because you'd been walking on this like very squishy moss and traipsing over things. It was hard. It was kind of hard to walk straight. Like when you've been at sea for a long time or something.
Just wanted to thank both of you, Russell and Lauren, for this wonderful talk today. And what struck me, Lauren, when you talked about keeping that positive outlook, and I was hearing from you also, Russell, although you didn't frame it in those terms, when you were talking about the legislative thriller part, those evil senators. Well, perhaps they're just trying to protect their own, but at the same time, the question that I had was, how do you keep yourself from getting crushed by cynicism? With all, it just seems so overwhelming. And perhaps you've answered that in a way when you talked about keeping up the fight. You just keep on doing it, but how do you keep from getting crushed from it? Just seems very overwhelming.
Well, it can be overwhelming, and it is overwhelming. And I have two responses to that, Chia. And I just want to say, Chia and I were classmates back at Brown, and it's great seeing you. And our lives have intersected many times since we graduated from Brown. So, I'm a historian. That was my degree at Brown. And if you read in history, almost everywhere, particularly in Western history, which is where I've done most of my reading, so I can't speak to other cultures and other histories, but there's a strain of apocalypse. There's a part. It's certainly Christ himself was an apocalyptic preacher or rabbi, in the sense that he said the world was going to end, and it's been throughout our history. There's always a sense of ending. One, and two, in many respects, the world was a really dangerous place. Those cities were walled, and they were walled with a reason. They were attacked on a regular basis, and people were killed. And it's funny, how throughout history we have had to reckon with the apocalypse, whether religious or whether in reality. The pandemics they suffered, the plague and smallpox and whatnot, were just relentless again and again and again. So there's something about the human psyche that I think has been forged in Armageddon, as much as I can say that. And we have to find our solutions where we can. We find it in the butterfly. We find it in, extraordinary tree. We find it in the sunset. We find it in love and connection. And I think that's where we always need to be, is present to the beauty, even in the face of evil or Armageddon.
Good words to live by. Thank you.
I'm sorry.
Good words to live by.
Yeah.
Yeah, any other questions or comments? Quemmons, question/comment?
I'm curious for both Russell and Lauren, what projects are next on the horizon in terms of writing?
Yeah, good question. So I continue to write about the applied work that I do for Popular Audience. So I recently wrote a piece about the real cost of planting trees and trying to increase investments in restoration projects so that they have benefits for people's livelihoods and biodiversity, in addition to kind of the carbon that's driving them. So I wrote a piece for Scientific American. I've written some other pieces about some of the adaptation. I work for an outlet called Emergence Magazine. I'm kind of at this moment where I am feeling like the projects I do are really applied and helping people deal with climate change in their communities, but I'm also very eager to write another book. So I have been kind of tackling various stories related to a larger book about really to what extent can forests help combat climate change, but told through the story of communities that have reversed the trend from deforestation to reforestation, and by breaking down the science globally of what can they actually do into the future to combat the problem. So I'm kind of at this stage where am I going to leap into it and spend a year, and we'll see what happens this summer. I feel ready. If you gave me a month, I'm ready to start going, but I needed to make the decision to leap. The current title is Where Trees Meet Tomorrow, but we'll see.
Well, Lauren humbles me if she can write a book in a year. God damn. I,
I've been thinking about it for 3 or 4. So, but yeah.
I'm in the middle of a book now, and I've just started it a few months ago. So when I was in my early 30s, I sailed around the world in a little boat called a Virtue. It's a 25-foot wooden boat that was designed back in the 30s. Beautiful little boat. And the cut I'm going to take, so lots of people have sailed around the world, but this kind of speaks to Chia's question. The theme of the book, or the kind of underlying metaphysical or existential basis of the book is, how do you live in the world? How do you want to engage the world? And I'm not thinking politically here. I'm much more thinking, I'm an old man. I think much more spiritually in the sense of, how do you invest your understanding? How do you live your life with a sense of awe, with a sense of wonder, with a sense of, transcendence? And, there are many times when I sat on the deck of that boat in the middle of an ocean and watched the sun come out of the sea and see frigate birds sailing overhead, or I'll tell you a quick story. I wake up in the middle of the night and check the sails and check the compass to make sure that we were still on course. And one day I did that, and I didn't put my glasses on. I'm, really myopic, and I look up at the sky, and it's a starry sky. There's no clouds in it. And in the Lesser Magellanic Cloud is a big star that's not there. At that time, I didn't use a GPS. I was celestial. I was using a sextant, so I knew the stars really well. And I said to myself, "There's no star down there." But who argues with the universe? If there's a star there, there's a star there. Russell's wrong. So I didn't put on my glasses, and I went back to sleep. And so a few days later, I sailed into Tahiti, and on the cover of the international copy of Time magazine was the picture of the first supernova that you could see with the naked eye in 400 years. And I didn't even put on my bloody glasses. So, keep a sense of wonder and a sense of awe about the world.
Well, I think those are some great closing words for our event today. And maybe some people will catch the meteor shower, some remnants of the meteor shower still happening, right? So we can put that on our schedule.
That's my little boy over there, even though the names don't match.
Oh, okay. Nice. I was
in.
wondering, he's a Brown 36, something like
There you
that.
go. My husband and I will have to battle over Brown or Stanford, but I'm still lobbying for Brown.
Well, on Earth Day, Earth Night, I don't want to keep anyone too long on Zoom. You still have some moments to get out and enjoy the rest of the evening, and perhaps the meteor shower, etc. So thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you so much, Lauren and Russell, for sharing your work and your stories. And hopefully alums, we have about 3 events a month currently on Zoom, but eventually we will be migrating back into the real world again. So continue to check our website and contact us if you need to receive our newsletter if you're not currently receiving it. But I think our next event is on Sunday, where we're recreating Blue Room muffins from the Ratty. So if you want to
That's awesome.
relive the love of the Ratty.
Thank you for organizing this. Really, Sarah, it's so nice to see you. I haven't seen you in a really long time.
Thank you, Lisa.
So good to see you. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Great.
Good night.
Bye, Allison. Bye,
Meet you
Dan.
all.
Bye, Lauren. Say
Hi,
hi to
Kathy.
Matt Calder for us.
I will.
Bye.
Come visit us.
Russell.
Bye. Thank you for your
Bye,
question.
Chia.
Bye.
That's fun. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for spending
It was
some
fun.
extra time on Zoom. I know Zoom can be a drag, so
It's kind of refreshing. I miss Brown's people. It's great. Brown colleagues. I don't have many out in Bozeman. I'm sure there are others. Actually, someone emailed me just recently. She said, I saw you're in